Greetings from the United Nations headquarters in New York. I'm Lisa Kingo, CEO and Executive Director of the UN Global Compact. The UN Global Compact brings together business, government, civil society, organizations to advance UN goals and values through responsible corporate practices. With more than 10,000 companies based in more than 160 countries and 68 local networks, the Global Compact is the world's largest corporate sustainable initiative. Today we will discuss the issue of violence and harassment in the workplace. In June last year, the International Labour Conference adopted a new convention aimed to combat violence and harassment in the world of work. Known as Convention 190, it is the first ever legally binding treaty that sets standards for ending violence and harassment in the workplace. Violence and harassment at work is a massive issue affecting all countries and occupations. Not only are violence and harassment violations of a worker's human rights, they also have profoundly negative effects on health, on well-being and productivity. According to the World Bank, there are no specific laws covering sexual harassment in employment in more than 1/3 of all countries. This represents an enormous legal gap for millions of workers. And in the countries that do have a law, it is not always applied. The ILO has discovered many gaps in legal protection relating to violence and harassment in the workplace. For example, those workers most exposed to violence, such as domestic workers and farm workers, are often excluded. This is why it's so important to have this new labor standard, Convention 190, which has been agreed by ILO member governments, worker representatives, and employers' organizations. Sexual harassment in the workplace is unacceptable, and recent movements like Me Too and Time's Up have brought much needed public attention to this issue. It's clear that access to dignified work around the world can only be ensured by concerted action against abuse by the involvement of all stakeholders, especially private sector companies. For today's discussion, I'm delighted to be joined by ILO Director-General Guy Ryder, the CEO of CNA Mexico, Kelly Kroger, and L'Oreal's Vice President for Diversity and Inclusion, Margaret Johnston-Clark. Thank you for joining me to discuss how business leaders can create a safe, inclusive, and fair work environment for all workers. For those watching, we will be answering your questions live, so please submit them anytime using the Q&A feature on the Zoom platform. So, Director General, thank you very much for joining us from Geneva today. And to start our discussions, it would be very good if you would tell us more about this new convention, how we should understand the whole issue of violence and harassment, and also the impact you are hoping the new convention will have.
Well, thank you very much, Lisa. Thank you for including us in this important conversation. Let me just take you through some of the basic features of Convention 190, which, like you, we consider to be of major importance. What it does at the outset is to establish the proposition that everybody at work has the right to a workplace which is free of violence and harassment, and that such abuses can constitute an abuse of human rights. That's a starting point. It defines violence and harassment as part of what can be a range of behaviour, which has the common feature that it results in or is aimed to produce damage, harm to people, which might be physical, it might be psychological, it might be sexual, and it might be economic. And it calls upon governments and indeed private enterprises to take the necessary measures to eradicate such abuse. It's a very inclusive, this is the first point I want to make, a very inclusive convention. It covers all categories of working people, even including job applicants, people working outside a formal workplace, even encompasses people in commuting, and actually recognises the relevance of domestic violence to the world of work as well. Governments are required to take legislative action and put in place policies that would produce this environment free of violence and harassment, and employers are required to take a certain number of measures to make sure that the workplace itself is free of these abuses. It's important that I should emphasise that the responsibilities falling on private enterprises are clearly said to be commensurate with the degree of control that an employer can be reasonably expected to exercise. And there is, of course, therefore, very much a degree of realism in what is expected of the different actors in the world of work. In this regard, the aim of the Convention is also to have put in place monitoring processes. There should be sanctions in place. There should be clear access to remedy for those who fall victim, despite all of this, to acts of violence and harassment. We do understand as well that training and information has to be a major promotional part of this effort to get rid of violence and harassment. And I think you'll see from all of this is a very multifaceted approach. It's well understood that violence and harassment is often very difficult, certainly to measure. We know there's a lot of it taking place in the world of work, but none of us are in a position to provide very comprehensive or reliable statistics. But we need, I think, to bring these issues into the open and have a very, very combined effort by governments, by trade unions and employers to get to where we really need to get to, this world of work which is free of violence and harassment. So we look forward very much to working with all of our partners, including the Global Compact in the UN system, with private enterprises, of course, and we'll be hearing some of the voices of the private sector in a moment, with the labour sector, to make a reality of this convention. Let me conclude, Lisa, by saying that we're really very pleased with the reception that this convention has received. We don't adopt ILO conventions every day of the week, as it were. The last one was in 2011, so this is something of an event. And I'm enormously encouraged by the fact that many of our member states are already saying that they're ready and they're preparing for the ratification of this convention, because I should emphasise that these conventions become binding at the national level once ratified by decision of our member states. This is going to come through very quickly. So in a sense, we've taken the first step on a long road, but I think the hard work really begins right now with the people who are in this conversation.
So guys, thank you very much for this excellent overview. I know that we have many people from the private sector watching our Academy program today. So what would be your message to business people? I mean, how should they go and inform their CEO and their board of directors at a very strategic level in the company about this new convention and what this sort of strategic impact of the new convention will have on the company?
Yeah, it's a great question. What I think is really, really important is that enterprises, the private sector, embrace this new convention, not in any way as something which is being brought in from outside and imposed upon them, but is something that they want to integrate into their enterprise life, into the way their enterprises work. I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest that where violence and harassment is not present in a company, not present in a workplace, those companies tend to be better and more productive places to work. So it is very much a partnership. In, I think, the near future, the business sector will be asked about ratification prospects in different countries. I would really urge business to put their weight behind ratification. We want these obligations to be assumed by all parts of the world of work. And once that's there, well, let's work together. Let's work out how at the enterprise level, the responsibilities of business can be taken up successfully, and how the good experiences that will be produced by this process can be shared between us, so that we can all move together on the basis of the fullest information on best practice.
Thank you so much, Guy. I'll come back to you later in the program. So, as the Director General highlighted, the real work begins now. And if the promise of the convention is to be translated into reality, companies will really need to step up and do their part. Violence and harassment is not an easy issue to tackle, but businesses have an important role to play and also a lot to gain. We know that safer working environments lead to improved performance, productivity, and retention of staff. So to provide more insights into what businesses can do to help in eliminating violence and harassment in the workplace, we have invited two colleagues from leading companies on this topic. So let me now turn to Ms. Kelly Kroger, the CEO of C&A in Mexico. So Kelly, let me ask you, why is elimination of working and harassment such a big priority in C&A, who's a very important fashion company in the world?
First of all, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm glad to be with you all today. C&A is a brand, a family-owned brand for the last 178 years. And we know that there are a lot of workers that are vulnerable in the supply chain within the apparel industry. And so we want to work and collaborate in order to make sure that we can attack this issue. The apparel industry, given a lot of the countries where the factories are located, including Mexico, where I currently work, there are cultural issues. There are also typically all of the workers in the factories are female, and over 90% of the supervision in factories are male, which also lead to putting those women in vulnerable situations. As well as the evolution of the apparel and fashion industry, which increasingly puts pressures for productivity, low cost, that also can be additional factors to creating situations where violence can take place.
That's very exciting. And I mean, now we have the new convention. So could you give us a couple of examples of how the new convention and the contents can help you in your daily work in putting better practices in place?
Of course. I think this is a great initiative because as much as a private company or multinational brand would like to eradicate this issue, it's a very complex issue and it manifests differently in different countries, given the cultural aspects. And it really is an issue that needs to be worked through collaboration with both public and private sectors. One of the things that C&A does globally, and I perform here in Mexico, is that we audit 100% of our supply chain every year. And so we have over 2,000 productive units that we audit every year, at least once a year. And part of that audit is to interview privately employees, look for signs of workplace harassment and violence. We also have installed globally hotlines where workers within our company, but also within our supply chain, can call and report this as well as other issues that are going on in our supply chain. However, it is an issue that is hard for us to detect. Employees are often not willing or open or feel secure enough to report these things. And so we really also need the support of the government structure to implement legislation that will help regulate the sector and the factories, but not just redact legislation, but make it real and enforceable so that we can work together from two different points of view to ensure that those situations are improving and being eliminated out of the supply chain.
So it's an excellent point that you need really good partnership with the government to make sure that the new convention is ratified in all the countries where CNA is working. So how are you partnering up with governments in Mexico and in different countries to make sure that there's a sort of positive ambition loop between the private sector and the governments to really make sure that the new convention is properly embedded?
Yes, in CNA, we actually have two different separate organizations that both focus on these types of issues from different points of view. From the business perspective, as I mentioned, we work with our suppliers, with our supply chain and our business partners to not only audit and ensure that certain standards are being respected, but also be advocates for why employee well-being and safety are also good business decisions. And then we also have on a global basis a CNA corporate foundation, which allows us from a different angle to work with governments, work with grassroots organizations, work with other foundations that are working from the ground up in order to attack these issues. One project that the CNA Foundation has done in the last year here in Mexico, in my market, is to work with one of the major universities here and their legal students in combination with the American Bar Association to create a clinic that provides free legal service to workers within our supply chain to get information and help in addressing violations of their human rights, and to include the students that are up and coming in the law system here in Mexico to promote that the next layer, the next generation of legal advocacy comes from the local base. And so we're able to do it both from a business, but also from the lens of a foundation, which allows us to be very effective and try to attack very different angles in this situation.
Thank you so much, Kelly, for these great insights and great examples. It's really good to hear. So L'Oréal has played a very active role in supporting the adaptation of the convention as well. So last year, your company put together a coalition of companies to support publicly the creation of this ambitious convention. So in November 2018, L'Oréal was the first company to join 1 in 3 Women, the first European network of companies engaged against gender-based violence. So in France, the group initiated the STOP initiative, a joint commitment by 30 companies to fight against casual sexism within companies. So it's my great pleasure to welcome you, Margaret, and maybe you can tell us a bit more of why this whole topic is so important to L'Oréal.
Yes, hello, and thank you for inviting me and for inviting L'Oréal to partake in this conversation. We were really proud to join the NGO CARE last spring and really be able to support the voting of this convention, because it stood for everything we've been implementing for the past, I'd say, 15 years as a company. L'Oréal, so I'm in charge of diversity and inclusion, but I work very closely with the ethics team and with the HR team to, as the gender issue, but mostly here, the harassment and the violence in the workplace has been part of our agenda, I would say, since actually probably close to 20 years. It's a priority for our top management, for our CEO by definition, We've had a code of ethics that was launched in 2000 that implemented a certain amount of behaviors that were ruled in this code. We also put together several specifics about reaching gender equality through women leadership, through gender pay gap, reducing it, but mainly through certain commitments like the Women's Empowerment Principles, which we signed in 2014, and the Human Rights Policy in 2017, which we actually revised as we were so involved in 2018 and 2019 on combating ordinary sexism in the workplace, but also domestic violence and the role it has, we have as companies to address this issue. So there was a specific employee human rights policy that was written then and launched to all of our employees worldwide in January of this year. So I would say, to sum up, it's a long-term commitment. It's part of what we do. We have 2/3 of our employees who are women. Most of our consumers are women. So this is something that we think is absolutely crucial to our day-to-day life, and offering a safe and inclusive workplace is always, or should be and will be a part of our agenda.
Great. So I think you're giving a very convincing story of how being a responsible company is a perfect mix with the business model and the stakeholders and the customers of the organization. So that makes a lot of sense. I'm keen to ask you a little bit more about the Whistleblower initiative that you have set up in L'Oreal. I think many other companies might be interested in what you have done. So could you elaborate a little bit on that, please?
Sure. So as I said, we started off with the Code of Ethics in 2000. In 2008, we launched, as part of our zero tolerance policy towards bullying, sexual harassment, and discrimination, we launched our Speak Up, which was then called Open Talk policy, which basically enabled employees to address and speak up if they were victims, or if they had witnessed other employees being victims of harassment or sexual bullying or harassment. This is something that we put together. Was really driven by the ethics team at a global level. And then this is precisely when we started to discuss and see that there were certain things that we were not addressing, like domestic violence. And that's one of the things we really supported in this convention in Article 11 was the role and the responsibility of companies on this domestic violence issue, which was not really being tackled before as openly.
Great, thank you very much for sharing that. The L'Oreal company is based in France, that definitely have a strong history in these areas. Do you think that the fact that the company is based in a very concerned country also plays a role in terms of the culture and the roots of the company?
It probably has an effect. I think it's more about the corporate culture than the nationality. It's the values we have had for over 110 years of transparency, of support, so I think it's more about, I don't think it's about the country where our headquarters are based. Our CEO is actually French, but he became really aware of diversity and inclusion when he was head of L'Oreal in the United States. So I think it's a mix, and it's because we're a global company and we have over 160 nationalities that we have to kind of adapt and be incredibly attentive to offering an inclusive workplace. So I think it's more about making sure that our people, their differences are taken into account, that they feel comfortable speaking up if they find themselves in a difficult or painful situation, and that we have the means to do so and to actually really apply. So for instance, for the last couple of years, our chief ethics officer and our chief people officer have both written to all of the employees around the world, addressing exactly how many cases of sexual or sexual harassment or bullying have been notified, and how these cases, what happened in these cases, and being very transparent about the way that the policy, the Speak Up policy, has actually enabled us to move forward. So in a time since Me Too, we found that more and more people wish to speak up, and we need to address this issue by creating the proper tools and the proper teams to be able to hear people disclose and then help them address the issues.
Thank you so much, Margaret, for these important insights and also for emphasizing that this topic is clearly a global issue that we are experiencing across the world. So now we are open for questions from the audience. And I would like to go back to Mr. Ryder with a specific question that relates to what is the connection, do you think, between a gender-based policy and the new convention that relates to violence and harassment? Can you advise on how companies should try to combine the two?
Yeah, I guess just 2 points I might make, Lisa, around that. Throughout the negotiation of this convention, gender-based violence and harassment was very much to the fore. And if you look at the text of the convention, it emphasizes that we do need an integrated, gender-responsive approach to these abuses. But I do have to say, it's not limited. The scope of the convention is not limited to gender-based violence only. There are other forms as well. But that said, you're asking me a question which is of great importance. Look, I think the point about company responsibilities, and I think it's come out of the things that Kelly and Margaret have already said, is that fulfilling the requirements of this convention is very clearly good business practice, the sort of things that Oriad and CNA, with whom the ILO works, want to do. So we're all pushing in the right direction. But when this convention was under negotiation, a lot of the question was, how much of the responsibility for action lies with government? How much lies with the enterprise? And as I said earlier on, the convention sets out very clearly what is required of enterprises, what's required of them. So they're required to put in place workplace policies against violence and harassment. They are required to try to integrate these issues into their overall, for example, safety and health management policies. They're required to carry out risk assessments in the workplace and to provide the appropriate training and information. So these are things which the convention call upon enterprises to do, and I repeat, in a way which is commensurate with the reasonable control that they can exercise over the issues concerned. But beyond that, to try to go to your question more specifically, Lisa, it's really important, I think, that enterprises go beyond the strict requirements of the convention. We need leadership from companies like those taking part in this conversation. They can drive good practice as positive vectors along their supply chains. And this is a really important thing that we need to see done. And there's simply, the leadership example, the example effect of good practice that we need to see. And it's happening all the time. It's happening all the time in the business and human rights agenda, the exercise of due diligence in human rights issues. So there's an awful lot that we can do together here, which I think creates momentum and takes us to where we want to be. Could I say that, the larger players, the multinational players in the private sector can really help us to get these messages and good practices to some of the harder to reach parts of the economy. We've got to get to the small and medium-sized enterprises. We've got to get into the informal economy, too easily forgotten, but 61% of workers in the world work in informality. So there are challenges ahead. There's no use saying anything else. Big challenges ahead, and I think we have to join forces to address those challenges together.
Guys, thank you for bringing up the importance of universal principles in really building leadership in the private sector. And I want to take the opportunity to emphasize that at the UN Global Compact, we clearly have anchored everything we do in the 10 principles relating to the environment, to labor, to human rights, and to anti-corruption. And we are very strong in our views that the 17 global goals must always be anchored in the 10 principles and are a foundation for companies that want to show leadership in any of these areas and really be a sustainable leader. So let's dive a little bit into some of the questions that we are getting from our audience. And clearly this is a topic that many people are quite passionate about. So, Director General, I want to come back to you with a question from the audience that are saying, well, it's excellent that we have this new convention, but could it have been even stronger? I mean, is it too vague? What's your perspective?
Well, Lisa, you know, we spent quite a long time negotiating this convention. It's not something I wrote, it's something the governments, employers and workers of 187 countries wrote and came together with. Now, could it be stronger? Could it be more prescriptive? You know, that question can always be asked. But my view of this convention, and we've got quite a lot of experience on these things in the ILO, is this convention is rather well balanced. It's not over prescriptive. It doesn't go into too much detail. It sets out very important principles, and they are groundbreaking principles which should guide national level practice to eliminate violence and harassment. We know that the circumstances prevailing in different countries, whether it be Mexico, as we've heard, or somewhere in Europe or somewhere in Africa, these circumstances are very different, and they require that our approaches be adapted to those circumstances. And yet, we always have to be driving according to the principles in the convention. I think we got it about right, if I'm honest. And I should emphasize as well that with the convention, there is what we call a recommendation, an accompanying recommendation. It's not binding. It provides voluntary guidance about how the convention can be applied. And I think for those who want to seek, further detail about how these objectives might be reached, well, this recommendation provides really important supplementary guidance for those who are working in the area.
Thank you guys for sharing this. I mean, I think we have a new convention. We have really good guidelines. Now we need the convention ratified. We need companies across the world to become aware of this, implementing key points of the convention into their business practices. So we have a solid piece of work ahead of us, I feel. So we have another question, and Kelly, that's for you. So in CNA's hotline, so which people who are administrating the hotline, and how are you ensuring a high level of integrity in the way you administer the hotline?
Yes, in CNA, we generally operate with two separate whistleblower hotlines, one for our internal employees within our own organization, and another that is available to workers within our supply chain. For our hotline within our own organizations, all of those complaints are captured actually via a website, and those complaints can be reported anonymously. They go directly to our internal audit department, which is independent from a business influence. They work to investigate, to try to determine whether or not the claim is true, find evidence, interview. As we know, even within our own organizations, we take all of these complaints seriously, but it is often difficult to get evidence, as many of these situations happen between two people in private, and so there aren't a lot of evidence to find. And we also then come to our ethics committee that we create and have operating in each market, which I lead. And so all of those complaints I personally receive. I hear all of the evidence, the investigation, and we take decisions in terms of the case. We do that for more severe cases, but even when we find that the complaints are more rooted in labor climate or labor issues that aren't really abuse or harassment, we take those seriously too. And we go back into that part of the organization to understand what is causing that emotion and what is causing that unsatisfaction in that area. And we work with the leaders in the organization to make sure that that group is motivated and productive, and everything is operating according to our values. Our third-party hotlines also do the same. They go through a third-party vendor, and they are also filtered and reported anonymously, so that we allow all of that to come forward without any specific data on who is actually the whistleblower. And I think beyond all of that process, one of the most important things as the CEO of my business or as leaders in our organization is that we have to create a culture that makes it safe for those people to come forward and to speak up, and that they feel safe, that there won't be any repercussions, and that we are really walking the talk in these types of issues.
Thank you, Kelly. So Margaret, we have an interesting question for you. So companies that really want to get started in this area, that haven't done many efforts before in these topics, I mean, what would your recommendations be for where companies should start based on your experience?
I think I think that the first thing is to set up a clear guidance and provide the right resources and tools. One of the things, for instance, that we find incredibly effective is the awareness raising trainings and the campaigns that we've done. For instance, on a very recent note, something that we conducted last year on domestic violence, we asked specialized NGOs to come in, and we invited employees to attend these workshops for about 2.5 hours. It's good to do them quite tight, like no longer than half a day, enabling them to really raise awareness on something that they might have heard about, read about in the media, but not necessarily understood, and what their role is as a colleague, as a manager, as part of a team. And these are very easy to, I think, to organize. We have seen that on the diversity and inclusion trainings, it was mandatory. It's been mandatory for 15 years. All new employee to L'Oréal has to go through a day of awareness built on D&I. But on more touchy topics like domestic violence, it's interesting to do it in a shorter format. And with amazing organizations like Women's Aid in the UK, with whom we've worked across throughout in several countries, the feedback is quite tangible. People come out and they suddenly understand exactly what we're talking about. So I think my recommendation would be to really implement these awareness training sessions on several topics, a general one and then some more specific on gender-based violence, and then have clear guidances. You mentioned before an initiative that we launched with EY and Accor Hotel. Today we have over 50 companies that are part of this network, and this is a very simple program that costs nothing, which is a charter of 8 different principles on how to identify and basically what we call ordinary sexism. So a behavior that might be part of an everyday conversation, jokes, comments. How do employees get focused on it and realize that they need to change their behavior? So these are things that we did through the creation of different tools, different communication assets. Nothing, again, too elaborate, but taking quotes, showing little videos, and getting people more just aware of it. What was crucial, though, absolutely fundamental, was that our general management was behind it. and our CEO, and in this case in France, it was our French general manager who really had to actually write a memo to all of the employees here in France explaining why this was absolutely mandatory as a behavior and that we needed to lead by example and be aligned with our values of gender equity, for instance. So the must-have is to have the general management on board.
So true. Top management backup is really important. So we have a few people who are interested in understanding what are the barriers in companies to really push forward this agenda. So Kelly, may I go back to you and have your response, and then we'll come back to Margaret. What are the barriers for making this a success?
I think there are several barriers, and a lot of it goes to what Margaret just mentioned. One, it's absolutely important that top management is on board and they're true believers in this. Two, it's important to have integrity and to walk the talk. And so when an incident occurs, there has to be an action taken. If we find through our hotline and through our ethics committee behavior that's not appropriate, that person needs to leave. And if you're not willing to take that step, it will create a barrier because your integrity will be questioned, and it will prevent you in the future from having those initiatives taken seriously. I think also one of the biggest issues in terms of gender violence and bias is that it is very difficult to detect. It's very difficult to identify, and it's very difficult to get that reported and get that worked. And so that is part of an overall comprehensive program that companies need to have, more than just a policy, but also, similar to Margaret, having regular training and conversations about gender violence, about domestic violence, about diversity and inclusion, gender equity, gender bias, and all of the decisions that we make in our business day, especially when we take into account cultural differences, comments, jokes that may be appropriate or acceptable within the market or country you work, that cannot be allowed within the walls of this company. And so a lot of that is cultural change, and that takes time, and it takes consistency, and a conviction from the top down about how this is going to happen, and a zero tolerance on certain behaviors.
Thank you, Kelly. Yes, it is certainly a multifaceted issue we are dealing with. Margaret, let's hear from you at L'Oréal. What do you see as the main barriers for succeeding? What is going on there under the surface in the companies?
Well, there's definitely room for improvement, but I just want to tell Kelly I completely. I think she summed it up perfectly. I don't really have much to add, except maybe just to reiterate the fact that sometimes we do have victims who are reluctant to report and to disclose, and that's or to pursue legal claims. So this is an issue that we need to face and that we need to address. And there is so much stigma still attached to being victim of a sexual harassment, whether it's happened in the workplace or whether it's happening at home, and we're bringing the issue to work because there is really no other place to bring it to. We need to address the issue of the stigma and how this is not going to have any consequences on their career. This is something that we've seen, and it tends to be more women than men. We do have men who come up and who have the same issues, exactly for the same with domestic violence. It's not only women, but the vast majority are women. And so I would say that's the biggest barrier, is the reluctancy to really feel comfortable reporting and claiming pursuing legal claims. So I think we still have a huge amount to do on the stigma. And so we're doing campaigns exactly like in a completely different realm on mental health. There's so much related to that. So being scared of having one's career kind of end abruptly. So we need to reassure, and we need to make sure that we have the right tools and guidance again to help our employees go through it and move on. So we need to continue leading by example in that way, but we still have quite a bit to do.
Thank you so much, Margaret. We still have so much to do. I found it quite staggering in the World Economic Forum's latest report on economic gender parity that at the moment it will take more than 257 years to reach economic gender parity in the world. So it feels as if things are moving a little bit backwards on the gender front. And Guy, I want to come back to you for the sort of final words and recommendations to all our viewers today. So, I mean, the ILO is doing an amazing work, have just celebrated a very important anniversary. So what is your advice to companies across the world on the future trends, the future challenges in this area, and how you would like to see business pick up the gender agenda, the violence and harassment agenda, and how you see it being part of, how should I say, any company's priority going forward? So what's your future view on this topic?
Yeah, Lisa, our organisation is, last year was 100 years old, and here's an interesting anecdote. 100 years ago, our constitution, it's in the first paragraph, establishes the principle of equal pay for work of equal value. 100 years later, the global gender pay gap is oscillating around 20% across the world. So, we haven't actually got there. We're still a long way away from it. Women are still participating in labour markets at 20 percentage points lower levels of participation than men. So the worry is, I'm not sure if we're actively going backwards, as you've suggested, but we certainly aren't going forwards quick enough. And that's despite all of the legislation that's in place on anti-discrimination, on equal pay. So my view, and I think, the convention we've been talking about today is part of this, we really need to move forward in new and innovative ways. I'm not sure that the tools and the practices of the past, although they have produced positive outcomes, they're not going to get us where we need to be. So something which companies are very good at doing is innovating, being creative, finding new ways forward. And I think the conversation today has illustrated just what a leading role companies can play. It was really interesting to hear what was being said about, the tone having to be set from the top of a company if it's going to really filter desired behaviour through a company. I agree. People in the company need to feel not stigmatised and not intimidated coming forward to bring to the attention of company managers things which are wrong in the workplace. These are terribly important. But it's not just a voluntaristic agenda either. Companies doing the right thing in their own internal practices is very important. But, we need governments to play their role, and we need this combination of government regulation and action interacting appropriately with companies to take us forward. There are a lot of unintentional biases, unintentional discrimination out there maybe, and we have to work on that. But I also think in labour markets there are still a lot of invisible structural barriers holding back women in the workplace if we're going to stick to the gender dimension. But for other disadvantaged groups at work, it's the same story as well. And I think we just have to commit in the broadest possible sense to say that we won't accept these things. Cultural relativism is often used as an excuse, but we have to, take due cognizance of different circumstances around the world, but just accept, and you said it earlier on when you talked about the Global Compact, there are some universal principles, some, universal benchmarks that aren't subject to cultural relativism, and we all have to subscribe to and advance towards. But I think with the type of conversations we've had today and the commitment that we're hearing, we can look to the future, these enormous challenges with some optimism, and it's great to have had the opportunity.
Thank you so much. So it seems as if sexual harassment in the workplace is finally receiving the attention it deserves. Now is the time for businesses and for all of us to take intentional and concrete action to create an integrated, inclusive work environment that is free of discrimination and violence. We will need to do this together to make it successful. The UN has a very important role to play to guide and inspire business action on this issue. So that is why the UN Global Compact will continue to bring together companies from across the world to share experiences and showcase the policies that have already been developed, notably through our new Global Impact Initiative, Target Gender Equality. Target Gender Equality is an accelerator program for Global Compact participants focused on setting and meeting corporate targets for women's representation and leadership in business. Through performance analysis, capacity building, and advocacy, participants will be encouraged and supported to identify and address barriers that are hindering efforts to advance equality in their organization, including the prevalence of sexual harassment. Participants will also engage with other stakeholders, as we know that addressing sexual harassment and other barriers to equality requires cooperation and action from multiple actors. Now is the time for business and for all of us to take intentional and concrete action to create an integrated, inclusive work environment that is free of discrimination and violence. In wrapping up, I would like to thank ILO Director-General Guy Ryder, the CEO of CNA Mexico, Kelly Kroger, and the Vice President for Diversity and Inclusion at L'Oreal, Margaret Johnston-Clark, for joining us today. And thank you, our audience, for being part of this UN Global Compact Academy session. Thank you.